you may have heard something about an election coming up, and I want to talk about that. It's been way too long since I've talked with our next guest. He's covering all of this. He's got a great perspective on all of this. I am, of course, talking about John Nichols. John is the national affairs correspondent for The Nation. He's been traveling the country with Bernie Sanders and then with Beto ORourke in Texas. And he's been writing, as usual, a lot of great stuff over at The Nation. So without further ado, John Nichols, thanks for coming back on the program.
One of the great pleasures in these crazy times to be with you, my friend.
Well, and likewise, and we got to stick together in times like these. Let's start with this.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, and let's start with this because you've been putting out, as usual, a lot of great pieces. I encourage people to check out at The Nation. But let's start with this. The headline: the austerity hawks are coming for Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid. I started having 2011 flashbacks as soon as I started reading this piece. This is the old Republican playbook. Well, first, before we go into it, you wrote this because of some comments from Mitch McConnell, right?
Yeah. You know, nobody ever listens to Mitch McConnell, right? I mean, even Republicans just can't stand being in the room with the guy. He's such an off-putting figure that, to give you an example, after he delivered the Kavanaugh nomination for Trump and the Republicans, he got a standing ovation. And Trump himself said, well, that's probably the first time that Mitch McConnell ever got a standing ovation. So here you got a president saying about his Senate Majority Leader. He literally insulting the guy to his face. And that sums Mitch McConnell up. Nobody wants to listen to him. Nobody wants to pay attention to him. It just happens he's the most powerful man in America, maybe the world. He decides whether Trump's agenda goes forward. And frankly, he even tells Trump what's possible and what isn't possible. And so after they delivered the Kavanaugh confirmation, then he's doing some interviews. And somebody mentions that, of course, you know, they did this tax cut. And then they did this, you know, massive increase in defense spending and a couple other things. They said, well, we got projections now that the deficit is going to hit $1 trillion in very short order. You promised us that wasn't the case. And McConnell, of course, with, you know, willing to lie straight to your face, says, oh, well, that's because of, you know, the entitlement programs, Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid. We're going to have to do something about that. And then conversation goes on to the next thing. And I thought to myself, pause, let's stop. The most powerful man in America, maybe the world, just said that economic realities, which he created, and that is a $1 trillion deficit resulting overwhelmingly from the tax cut and from, you know, just out of control, crazy budget priorities, is, you know, heading us toward $1 trillion deficit. The way to deal with it, cut Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid. He didn't say cut, but of course that's what they mean by entitlement reform. So he put that issue on the table about 2 weeks ago. And the counsel I would give to you is, you know, you can listen to Trump all you want. The fact of the matter is Trump says a million different things in a day. Or you can listen to Mitch McConnell, who, to give you an example, said in the week of the most critical test as regards the Kavanaugh nomination, we will vote on this nomination this week, and delivered that vote on that Saturday. This guy calls the shots. He says that they're interested in going after Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid. If they get unitary power, i.e. the presidency, the House, and the Senate, which is still, I really want to emphasize, within the realm of possibility, not some, you know, beyond possibility notion,
right.
Even though I do think Democrats are doing pretty well in House races.
Mm-hmm.
If they get that, understand they've messed the economy up with their tax cut and a host of other things so badly that they're going to be moving on some stuff. And of course they'll lie about it. But this is an election about obviously Donald Trump's crazy and excessive and awful behaviors, about many of the other failures of the Republican Party. But it is an election about austerity. And if they get power, I promise you, they will come for the social safety net because, A, they've created a structural crisis that's going to, they will say requires it. But B, far more importantly, because they have to deliver for the people that fund them. And that delivery, I would suggest, would come very, very quickly and be a brutal battle. We need to be conscious of that.
Yeah, I want to talk. I agree with everything you said, and I want to talk a little bit about austerity here for our audience. I mean, we've had Stephanie Kelton and other economists on talking about how seriously should we take deficits, how seriously should we not take deficits. There's a whole vigorous debate going on in the economics world about that right now. But within Washington, D.C., there is conventional wisdom largely held by leaders of both parties and Congressional Budget Office and all sorts of people that says, deficits are a problem. And so whether you believe that's true or not, that is the way politics operates in this country. Now, you wisely quote in your piece Mitch McConnell as saying of the $1.5 trillion tax cuts for billionaires and multinational corporations that the Trump and the Republicans, all the rest of the Republicans passed, that Mitch McConnell said at the time, I not only don't think it will increase the deficit, I think it will be beyond revenue neutral. I think it will produce more than enough to fill that gap. Obviously lying, we knew it then, proved now by what's happened since then. And now, John, isn't this the oldest playbook? So austerity basically says, let's make sure the government has as little money as possible. So let's give tax cuts to millionaires and billionaires, and then let's starve it of the resources it needs to provide the public programs that its citizens benefit from. So, but isn't this the oldest Republican playbook in the world? Create a crisis with tax cuts that pay off their wealthy benefactors, and then say, whoops, we got a crisis, got to take it from the poor people and the old people.
That's exactly right. And see, here's the deal. It's like everything else. Are deficits good or bad? It depends on what you're doing it for, right?
Right.
If you run a deficit to beat fascism in World War II, I say, yeah, go for it. If you run a deficit to overcome or respond to a Great Depression, I say, yeah, go for it. You run a deficit to, invest in infrastructure and communities and really get the economy booming so that then you do have revenues coming in. Yeah, I can see that. But if you're running a deficit to give your wealthy campaign donors the largest tax cuts in history, tax cuts that they themselves say they don't need, and if you then use that deficit, and this is the key thing of how austerity works, use that deficit as an excuse to privatize fully functional programs that aren't the source of the problem, Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid, as well as to shred the social safety net, well, that's a bad use of it. It's sort of like air, Richard. Air can be healthy and wonderful, or it can be polluted. What Mitch McConnell is proposing is the most polluted use of deficit policy imaginable, or deficit talk, deficit response. That is going after Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, and the social safety net if they get unitary power. And I really want to emphasize to you that they will not tell the truth about this. They will go fast. They will go structural. They will put it into other things. They will do so-called change CPI and other things to slow down cost of living increases. They will, gut out elements of Medicaid and Medicare. They'll put on little, age increases for Social Security, Medicare, things like that. All the things we've heard about. And then at the same time, they will begin to, hold out these privatization schemes as alternatives. And you say, well, and logical people would say, well, why would they do that when Trump says they'll never do that? Well, with all due respect, Donald Trump ran for president talking about, at some points, relatively favorably about Medicare for all.
Mm-hmm.
And he is now out on the campaign trail savaging it as the most dangerous socialist thing you ever heard of. Donald Trump is all over the place. Mitch McConnell and the people around him are not. They've been looking for this chance forever. And I really cannot begin to emphasize to you, this is a big deal election on so many levels. But people who care about the long term should understand they have wanted to get their hooks in to Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security forever. They've gotten some hooks in forever. If they get unitary power and there's even a minor quiver in the economy, something that really does suggest that, their irresponsible and absurd approaches to all sorts of economic issues are coming back to bite them. They will use that scare as an excuse to start to really go in on these things. And frankly, I cannot imagine. I'm stunned that the Democrats aren't making this a central issue of this campaign.
Yeah, and I want to talk.
Much bigger issue than they have.
And I want to talk about that in just a second. Again, we're talking with John Nichols of the National Correspondent for the Nation. So I'm sitting here thinking, like, okay, so it's like the Republicans are running a used car lot, and this is the way I process what you're saying. And Trump he's the sales guy. He's out there hustling. You want to know whether that 78 Chrysler over there will really start. You don't talk to the sales guy. You talk to the mechanic in back who says, oh, yeah, you got to put it in neutral and roll it downhill and pump the gas a couple times. And so McConnell is like, this is what we're really going to do. Trump is a guy who will say whatever you want. And yeah, I don't get why Democrats aren't running on this either, because, John, I feel like Medicare, which is also tied to the Medicare for All conversation, but Medicare, Social Security, Medicaid, that these are issues, people say, well, they're old people issues. Well, number one, I've got some questions about that, yes and no. First of all, older people, we got to be careful as we move up demographic brackets, but older people do vote more in off-year elections, so they matter, number one. And number two, I would say that these are issues that should unify the generations, because when the Republicans go to taking a hacksaw to Medicare and Social Security, they're not going to do it for the benefits of the over 65s. They're going to do it for young people coming up now. So I would think for a variety of demographic reasons, this would turn out younger people. This would sway the votes of more older people. It's what, a pollster like Celinda Lake would call a valence issue, that actually shifts people's vote. So why aren't they doing it more?
I think the Democrats they have been in chaos as a party. And it's not some sort of fierce criticism of them. It's just, I understand the reality. They got handed their teeth in 2016. They could not figure out what happened. The reason that happened is because they misinterpreted a host of generational issues, and including automation of our economy, the digital revolution, all sorts of other things that have really shaken people of all ages. They know everything's changing. They don't know why. They don't know what to do about it necessarily. And so political leadership fills voids. Trump filled the void by running a xenophobic, backward-looking campaign, but the Democrats weren't doing an effective enough job of looking to the future. And so that's, quick 30 seconds on that. But as a result, the Democrats are continuing to struggle to figure out, what's our point? Where do we pivot? Where do we go from losing and not knowing how to do this to winning? And they're getting a lot of advice from all sorts of people, but it isn't enough in the zone of issue-oriented advice. And I would argue that issues win and lose elections. They mobilize people, and the biggest mistake that pundits and pollsters make, and politicians as well, is to operate on an assumption that there is a generational divide that pits the young against the old, and that these people, because they vote differently, don't don't have some shared concerns, some shared values. Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security poll fabulously among young people. They're incredibly popular among people under 35. They've got no problem politically, and there's a reason for that. Medicaid is not an old person's program. Medicaid is a program that affects people of all ages, and Medicare is obviously Medicare, Social Security, things that generally aim toward older folks, but have huge impacts for younger people. If you lose parents, if you're in disability situations, there's all sorts of overlap there, and young people are smart enough to know that. There's also something else. Medicare for all, which is the logical way to save Medicare and to expand it, obviously, to address other issues, to do something much bigger. Medicare for all is now so unimaginably popular among young people that you could barely contain it. 69% of people under 35 in the new Reuters Ipsos poll, 69% say they favor Medicare for all when it's described to them, not in some casual sense, but when it is described as a government intervention to expand Medicare and make sure that you have health care for all, availability of health care for all. And here's the interesting thing. Among younger Democrats or younger Democratic-leaning voters, that goes to 85%. And so if I'm doing, and by the way, independents around 70%, if I'm doing a mobilization campaign, if I'm trying to get people to the polls and to make something happen, I think running on, we will not let austerity cut Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid. And in fact, we will do the opposite. We will expand Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security. We will expand all these programs in ways that move wealth and power to the great mass of people. That's a winning campaign across the board, multi-generationally, and frankly, it's the one that would scare the wits out of Mitch McConnell and even Trump, because here you would be linking your absolute commitment to maintaining Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid against their threatened assaults with a commitment to expansion that actually solves all sorts of other problems. It's again, I'm not a strategist. I'm just talking to you about, the realities of what we see here. And it does surprise me that once McConnell started to literally hand issues to people, that some of the Democrats didn't jump to grab them.
Is it because of what we've seen instead, and I'm asking you to speculate, of course, but which you don't have to do if you don't want to, but is it because I'm thinking, for example, we've had a couple Midwestern or Middle America Democratic politicians just in the last several days. It's been reported, like Heitkamp and Donnelly on the Senate side, for example, say, well, in effect, and one of them, I think, literally, we're not those crazy Democrats. Do they somehow meaning?
Right. We wouldn't do something popular.
Right. Yeah. That's populism, and that's bad too.
We won't embrace popular ideas that are overwhelmingly supported. We want to assure you that we will continue to be the cautious, boring Democrats who win on the margins. Yes, there are some folks who say that.
Yeah.
And in fact, there are two kinds of players in the Democratic Party. One kind of player is, folks who literally don't get it, right? Who don't know how to push back against, Republican spin and lies. They may be ignorant. They may literally, just be overwhelmed. And then, of course, you do have people who are crooks.
Right.
Who do things for campaign money. Right. They're ones, and I'm not saying that's in both parties, and I think we have to be honest about it, that there are political players who are influenced by campaign donations that make them think that they have to be friendly to Wall Street or something like that.
Yeah, and I think that's
I'm not saying that that's the people we're talking about here. I just think that exists in both political parties. If we deny that, we're living in a fantasy.
Right, and I also think it's possible, and I'm sure you do too, John Nichols, to hold two ideas in your head at the same time. For example, the idea that there are politicians like that in the Democratic Party. The campaign cash affects some of them, which is a kind of soft or legalized corruption, and that the opportunity maybe to work for a hedge fund in their post-political lives might have an influence too. It's possible to hold that idea in your head and at the same time be aware that if the Republicans sweep the federal government again in next month's elections, we are in an extraordinarily grim scenario for the future.
That's right. That's right. And this is, what I am saying here is that Bernie Sanders, who's out on the campaign trail, says that this is the most important election of our lifetime. Now, I've debated with him a little bit on that because I happen to think there's a reasonable chance that 2016 was the most important election of our lifetime, and we blew it, right? Forces of light blew it. Donald Trump became president of the United States. That's a pretty bad thing, by any measure. And so it may be that the original sin occurred right then, and that makes 2016 the most important election of our lifetime. But if you have the possibility of cleaning up the mess, or at least addressing it in some way, that possibly this is the one. This is the critical point. But there's a third scenario where this could be the most important election of our lifetime, and that is, and this is the one that ought to scare people the most. If this is an election in which Republicans get unitary control of government, and then in short order roll out an argument that we are in a bad deficit situation, that it's slowing the economy down, and we have to, quote unquote, do entitlement reform, and they wrap it in a lot of spin and push it successfully. Now, I know that's hard because there's tremendous opposition, including among Republicans, to these ideas. But if they were to push that successfully and really begin to gut out Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid, that, as well as the rest of the social safety the social safety net, that is the point at which they undo the New Deal and the Great Society, right?
Right.
So they then succeed in undoing 100 years of social and economic progress as a result of one, maybe two elections if you combine 16 and 18. Because these are radical administrations, and one of the mistakes people make is to think that their radicalism is only, Donald Trump's obnoxious statements.
Right,
Donald
exactly.
Trump's horrible tweets, Donald Trump's xenophobic and racist behaviors. That's radical and awful, but man, if they create a reality going forward that undoes New Deal, Great Society, literally puts us into a privatized, permanent neoliberal situation, well, yeah, I will agree. This is the most important election of our lifetime, and if it goes bad, our lives will never be the same.
Yeah, I think that point can't be made too much, and I would add to it, by the way, they will step up their assault on democracy, which has already been, has scored some major successes. Our democracy has already lost a couple engines and is tilting a little bit in midair. And if they get to blow out the last couple engines in our democracy, we're in deep trouble because we could be looking at a 1,000-year regime or however long the country lasts once they,
but we don't even have to go to that. We don't have to go as far as that. I'm not saying that you're wrong in any of this. But what I'm telling you is the undermining of democracy, the weakening of democracy, and the recreating of democracy as a theater rather than a practical reality, as something, we still have elections and stuff like that, but voting rights have been so weakened, participatory democracy so diminished that those who are in power are incredibly well positioned to retain power. However that is done will be necessary, right? It won't be something they could do. No, it's necessary, and it's necessary because what they would be doing here is exceptionally unpopular.
Right, exactly. Yeah.
I mean, if they come for Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid, and people start to realize that, that's going to be very, very unpopular, and your only way to respond to that is to, really find ways to insulate against popular uprising, popular rebellion at the polls. Well, there's two ways to do that. One is, of course, voter suppression. We're seeing an immense amount of that this year. It's a serious issue. But the other way is to so warp the debate, so alter our discourse, and Trump is brilliant at this, that, we end up moving to the next issue 2 weeks later, despite our pain, right? And so I believe that Mitch McConnell and the radical neoliberals in the House and the Senate, who really do imagine a crony capitalist future in which the resources of the American government are redirected to enrich people who are already so fabulously rich it is almost beyond imagination. I think they see in Donald Trump a great salesman, as you suggest in that used car lot, and they've been wanting for a very long time to get the U.S. Supreme Court. Well, they got it. They figured out how to get the Supreme Court with the Kavanaugh nomination, despite everything that we saw. And if you don't think that they won't look at a position of unitary power, where they've got the House, Senate, and the presidency, as well as the courts, after November 6th, as an opportunity to do something they wanted to do for generations, you're just a fool, frankly.
Yeah, look,
they will make that move.
Look, I think, they think big, and Democrats don't tend to, as a rule, which gets to, and I want your thoughts on this. This is my theory of stasis versus momentum in politics, which I've never articulated before, but because I just thought of it, which is basically that, if you articulate where you're going and appear to have that momentum, building something, a different world, you're going to have a lot of energy around you politically. But if you're just kind of like, well, things are okay where they are now, there's no energy, there's no friction, there's nothing that, and I think that, now we have, once again, President Obama, as so many Democrats have done, scolding millennials for not voting more, as opposed to saying, this is, and it doesn't have to be grim and brutal, but it should be the opposite of grim and brutal. That's the Republican lane. But to say, this is the world we gave you Social Security, we gave you Medicare, we gave you Medicaid, and here's what we're going to do next. What do you think?
To do the next thing, right? Trust us to take it forward. Yeah, that's the message. And the weird part is that this gets to the heart of the matter. How do you beat Donald Trump? A huckster, a patent medicine salesman who will peddle whatever he thinks can sell in that moment, right? But always defaults to an ever more powerful military-industrial complex, an ever more powerful Wall Street, ever wealthier elites, ever greater inequality, the whole bit. How do you deal with that? Well, the way to answer that is not to say, well, we'd be better managers.
Right.
We could manage this circumstance better than he could. Now, he's not offering you management. He peddles the fact that he's a wealthy guy, and that's supposed to mean something, but he's not offering you management. He's offering you great big promises. The counter to that is a different set of promises, and frankly, a different vision. Not a managerial vision, but a change vision, a vision that says, yeah, we are in one of the most transformative moments in American history. We are facing the equivalent of 3 industrial revolutions at the same time. We're 30 years into a globalization revolution. It's changed everything about how we relate to the world. We're 20 years into a digital revolution. It's changed everything about how we communicate, how we interact with one another, even changing our politics in all sorts of ways. We're 8 to 10 years into an automation revolution that is and will. It's changing everything about our work. And how we work is different now. It will be radically different in 10 years from now. Then you overlay that with a climate revolution that at this point is going in exactly the wrong direction. This is overwhelming stuff. And the answer to that is an optimistic proposal to say, we can deal with it all. We're not going to manage this mess. We're going to get out of this mess. We're going to get on top of globalization, digital revolution, automation revolution, climate change. We've got a vision for the whole thing. And it's as big and as bold as the New Deal, as big and as bold as the Great Society, and beyond that. That's how you counter Trump. And you know what would happen? Already, here's the fascinating thing. Bernie Sanders, other progressives, have put Medicare for all on the table. It's the one thing that Donald Trump is talking about. Now, he's ripping into it, calling it, the worst thing in the world, blah, blah, blah. But you understand what has happened there is Donald Trump has been taken off his messaging to talk about a Democratic or a progressive issue. You need to be doing that on about 10 different things so that Donald Trump doesn't define the discourse about caravans at the border or, whatever other, issue he's ginning up at the moment.
Well, I think that's absolutely right. And it is a fascinating topic. John Nichols, we only have a minute or two, but I don't want to let you go before asking. I know you're down in Texas right now with Beto ORourke, and I know that you were in Arizona at the border with Bernie. How's it looking from the ground there?
It's very interesting because we really are in this mobilization moment. I think there are issues that can crack some Trump voters away from Trump, and those you shouldn't dismiss them. But at the heart of this thing, both parties are really trying to draw massive new numbers of voters to the polls. That's the heart of what you're seeing in Texas with Beto ORourke, what you're seeing with Stacey Abrams in Georgia, Andrew Gillum in Florida, and a host of other states. The Republicans are not really trying to mobilize their vote. They're just trying to keep it, in play, keep it strong. And so that's Trump's goal. He's trying to regenerate and re-energize his coalition. That gets him, by the way, in nationwide to 46%. He didn't get 50%. He got 46% of the popular vote. We don't have an electoral college this year. So understanding many of the states that are in play, him mobilizing his coalition only gets him to a minority of the needed electorate, right? Doesn't get him to necessarily 50%. But if the Democrats fail to mobilize, he might win on that. He can win by mobilizing his presidential coalition and getting them out because lower turnout in midterm elections. So the key for the Democrats challenging this is to really get people excited, get them energized. What I am seeing on the ground in some places is really quite impressive. There's a hidden story in New Mexico. The Democrats in New Mexico look to be on top of everything. I'd be very, very surprised if they don't have a major, major success this year, running a really diverse slate of people, a lot of women for top offices, a lot of Latinas. It's a very effective campaign, very impressive. What I'm seeing with Beto ORourke in Texas is striking. They have pop-up offices in some of the smallest towns in Texas. You can literally drive into small towns in Texas where you haven't seen a Democratic operation in generations, and they're on the street. They literally have the signs up. They've got the office. They're doing the walking list. And so, I think that ORourke, whether he wins or loses, and it's clearly an uphill run against Ted Cruz, whether he wins or loses, he is clearly putting a new model in play. I think Abrams is doing the same. I think Gillum's doing the same. I think some of these people are going to win. That's a very big deal. And the final thing I would suggest, though, is this is still a tough, volatile year. Trump is clearly not going to give this thing up until the very last minute. He'll be campaigning on election eve someplace. And he will keep evolving his messages. The critical thing in these last 2 weeks, frankly, in my view, is the Democrats want to get the House, potentially get the Senate, which I think is very hard, but they want to do that. They need coherent, strong messaging that can be heard at a louder level or at least the equal level of Donald Trump. They cannot win this thing on the margins. That is a very big deal, and I think that's the greatest danger in the next 2 weeks is simply being responsive to Donald Trump or, just trying to let him do the narrative. That's wrong. You need a counter narrative, and it has to be very coherent. And if it is, I think this could still be it's going to be a transforming election. We just don't know how much and to what extent.
No, and in which direction. So a great summary.
Yeah,
So,
I think it's a dangerous time.
yeah, it is. It's Schrodinger's election. We just don't know if we're, going into better times or worse. Yeah. But unfortunately, we're going to have to leave it there. John Nichols, national correspondent for The Nation. Your latest book is Horsemen of the Trumpocalypse, unless you've written 6 since then. And in which case, you'll have to come back and talk about him. As always, great to talk to you, and thanks for coming on the program.
It's a pleasure, my friend. I'm glad to be with you, and you're very wise, as always.